We have approached the final session. I'm very happy to say. I'm sure we're all very happy to say. And this panel is going to be a little bit different. People do not have presentations to give. We're going to have a discussion among us. You can see I'm sitting here as opposed to standing in the middle. And although, believe me, this dais is not worthy of an interior designation, we're going to try nonetheless to look at each other, because my goal here is not to have a conversation mediated through me. I'll throw out some red meat or some questions, I guess is what they're really called. But the idea really is to have the panelists discuss the various issues that have really come up during the day. Another purpose of this panel and another goal of this panel is to try and talk less in generalities and to be a little more specific about concrete changes to the law or to the Landmarks Preservation Commission. I mean, to be sure, we can argue about whether the LPC has been too intrusive or not intrusive enough, too political or not political enough. It benefits one group over another group, that the costs are too high relative to other groups. We can argue about that, and those are excellent arguments, and I'm all for them, and it's fun, and those of you who want to stay around after 5:15 can pursue those in the generalities or specifics as you like. But I have asked in advance all of these very distinguished panelists to really try and focus on specific concrete changes. Whether they will follow my admonishments is a whole other question. There is a quality of being critical, and I think we all want to be critical, but I'm using the word critical not as in negative. Critical in the sense of examining critically the strengths and the weaknesses of the law and the Landmarks Preservation Commission. All right, so again, that's another mandate that I've given to this terrific panel. And then finally, I've not been surprised. I think the room setup a little bit discourages audience participation. If we start running out of steam, and I'm about to run out of steam in another 2 minutes or so, but if this panel runs out of steam, and if the panel doesn't follow my request to have a dialogue among itself, and I don't have anything more to say, then I'm going to really turn to all of you. Now, we're out of microphones, by the way, because we had to use them up here. So you can shout out your question, and for purposes of the video, I will in fact repeat the question. But you're welcome to start thinking now about what you would like to ask all of these people up here, because this is a nice kind of opportunity. So let me start. A little bit of what I'm saying is repeating what's been said at different times during the day by myself and by many others, but I think these are some of the fundamental points that we need to address. So, is landmarking under the Landmarks Law too untethered to and unreflective of other goals and needs in the city? Is the Landmark Preservation Commission, as envisioned by the law itself, and I read you the law this morning and we've read it before, too siloed in what it does from the rest of planning and policy in the city? Is it too separate, too divorced, too myopic, too blindered, too powerful? And by the way, if it is, that leads to suggestions for changes in the law or changes in the role of the Landmark Preservation Commission, which would mean changes in the law, or changes in other laws that would bring other bodies in. Or alternatively, and by the way, let's say it, shouldn't it be blindered and myopic and focused strictly and exclusively on landmarks and historic districts and interior landmarks and scenic landmarks? And special merit, leave that to the mayor and the city council and the city planning commission, somebody outside of the commission. Let the commission do its technical work of landmarks and historic districts. We can argue about what is a landmark or what is a historic district, but for God's sakes, don't ask this, and we know, volunteer commission, not being paid to suddenly take into account, gee, should we do this landmark or should it be affordable housing? Is that really what the commission should be doing? All right, so let me turn to you, Peg, and ask you, what do you think?
That was 82 questions. I think the Landmarks Law has never been accepted by some segments of the real estate community as a legitimate law. It's as legitimate as zoning. It's as legitimate as what the buildings department requires you to do. But for some reason, it's never been given the acceptance. So all this talk about, is the commission too powerful? Is it to this? Is it to that? I think the commission is sometimes siloed by the various administrations that it works in. The Landmarks Commission is often last to the table. When Mayor Bloomberg put forth his Midtown East plan, city planning very helpfully had red X's on all the great masonry buildings around Grand Central as likely development sites, and then said, oh, by the way, landmarks, take a look. I don't believe, we're now looking at Midtown East again, and the Bloomberg Commission has studied the area, this commission has studied the area. The study group that has been looking at the larger section of Midtown has begged landmarks to come in and designate the buildings that they think should be landmarked. And yet, I don't know if they will ever be able to do that. We'd certainly love to see it. So I think that part of the silo comes from the way that landmarks has been treated by both the real estate community and sometimes by administrations as not the equal of the other levels of government.
But would you want to unsilo it? I mean, should the LPC be engaged in decision-making above and beyond what it's currently doing with regard to designation of landmarks and historic districts and certificates of appropriateness?
I'm not saying that necessarily, but years ago, in some sections of Midtown East, landmarks and city planning walked the blocks together, and they talked about what should be designated, what should be development sites. So there's a role, with its current role, to just be accepted into the larger scheme and have a chance to say, to work and figure out, what are we saving, where can we develop? And that hasn't happened in years, and it isn't happening now, and it should.
So beyond it should, what concrete proposal would you make in terms of institutional affiliations, changes to the law, changes in the operation of the LPC, beyond just saying, everybody should talk? We agree everybody should talk.
It's not, I don't think it's changes to the LPC necessarily. I think it's changes politically in administrations. I think there's it's incumbent upon those of us who are preservation advocates to, I think there's a huge preservation constituency that even though we've all tried in various ways, we have not managed to knit together and show elected officials that there is a huge block of votes for people who support preservation. It's clear in some individual districts, but across the city, I think if you really could poll people, there is a huge preservation constituency that we have not managed to, show City Hall or show other levels of government. So I think it's got to be a recognition on the part of whoever is mayor and whoever is running the city council that this is an important. Go back to the law. What were they talking about? Property values, the economy, tourism, all the local jobs that preservation has created. We are part of city planning. We are an important part of what makes New York unique and healthy and vital and attractive. And yet here we are 50 years into the law when we're celebrating all over town, it's under siege again. And we're back where we started, trying with the same people who never wanted the law in the first place, to try to say, we're not to blame for affordable housing, or lack of affordable housing. There are affordable housing units throughout historic districts. We're not to blame for raising rents. Look at property taxes, look at the water rates, look at just the sheer force of development. Everybody's talking about what are historic districts doing for gentrification. Look at what the administration is planning with huge upzonings in Brooklyn and Bronx and parts of Upper Manhattan that have residents terrified already, and that will have dramatic changes on those neighborhoods. Nobody's focusing on that. They're worried about all the bad things that preservation is doing when we're not.
Kent, I saw you shaking your head up and down at one point. What did that mean?
I always agree with Peg. Well, it seems to me that, as Peg just noted, it's really, I don't think there are any changes required in the Landmarks Law or the practice of the Landmarks Commission as much as the totality of the agencies and the effort made to deal with the physical city and its future is still a pretty depressing, uninspiring reality. You know, when a new administration comes in, and many of you have been in administrations, there's a few months of excitement because the commissioners change, but the staffs don't change, and the advocacy groups that deal with each agency don't change, and before you know it, the agencies fall back, as they must, into some relationship with their principal constituents. There was a lot of excitement after the war, in the period in which the Landmarks Law was born, about planning. There was a real belief in Europe and also in the United States, I think based in part on a misunderstanding of how successful the Soviet Union had been when they weren't successful. But there was a real faith that we could do comprehensive plans. This is reflected in Congress and in legislation establishing HUD, requiring comprehensive plans. Not only don't we have a comprehensive plan in New York of any sort, but our principal agency in charge of planning has more often than not been driven really as a zoning regulation agency. So it doesn't have, its responsibilities are so burdensome, the politics are so difficult in just dealing with the reactive world that they rarely step outside. There are wonderful exceptions. When John Zuccotti was the chairman of the City Planning Commission, I think there were some 60 community plans done. He would bring in people from the neighborhoods, he would bring in the agencies, and they would sit there for months, but they would get to some conclusion about the future of that neighborhood. That simple idea, which is followed in most of America, has no place in New York. We have 62, I think, community boards, each of whom has some 200,000 people. Who are these people? They're either people born here who have street sense, or people who moved here from Iowa or Bulgaria because they were really smart, and they're the leaders everywhere. This is the most talented city on the planet, but would we ever give them a role in shaping the future of their own neighborhood? Oh no, we couldn't possibly do that. So it seems to me that this complaint about silos is mostly raised, let's say, by groups like Rebney, if something's about to happen they don't like. I remember the Upper East Side Historic District, they didn't like. And so they complained to the mayor I worked for, Koch, that the Landmarks Commission is doing the Planning Commission's work. So we had to stop for about a year while the Planning Commission caught up and finally passed some zoning that was sympathetic to what it was that we were trying to do. There's no reason that could not have happened from the outset. So I think it's up to the administration here and the next administrations to try to engage the public and the agencies in some common discussion about what do you want your neighborhood to be.
All right, but so that's all fine, and we can talk, by the way, a little later perhaps about the notion of historic district boards at a more local level, which I know, Kent, you've talked about from time to time. I'm still not hearing, though, this is not a criticism, but I'm not hearing anybody suggesting that there needs to be, other than a cultural change, often, by the way, by some other body, not by the Landmarks Preservation Commission, maybe the City Planning Commission, maybe, Raju, what about the City Council? Look, leave planning to the City Planning Commission and to the City Council. Isn't that good enough? And let the Landmarks Preservation Commission do its thing, and if you guys want to slap down what the commission is doing, slap away. But don't put it on the commission to do it. Let them do their technical work very, very well, and that's the end of it. Yes? No? Maybe. I've given you the political answer out.
So let me totally avoid the question now. I think that the point that I think is worth highlighting here, at least from my particular lens at the City Council, is that that I worry, and I used to work at MAS and used to be on the community board and used to work at the Department of City Planning. I worry that preservation too often fails to engage with other disciplines, and that's not a matter of administrations changing or commissions changing. It's a matter of preservationists thinking about their role within this discussion differently. And so I would say that, yeah, we can point our fingers at the powers that be in terms of this conversation, but I think there's a question for the discipline in there too about what they see as their role in this discussion, and not just sort of knocking on the door and asking to be invited in, but really kicking the door open, or actually just having a conversation and inviting others in. And I think that is the issue that I worry most about with preservation, is in sometimes, just looking forward to the next 50 years is one of the themes of this panel, that preservationists are too concerned about the particular battle and not concerned enough about the war. And I think the war is really how the city is changing and growing and developing, and sometimes the battle transfixes the conversation in a way that I think is not useful for preservation and preservationists. And so I guess I would just respond to what Kent and Peg are saying by saying I think it's the responsibility of preservationists to not be afraid of entering into those conversations as opposed to being invited into those conversations.
Right. So far, by my count, we have 3 out of 7 on the panel talking about cultural changes, which incidentally are very, very important, to be sure. Preservationists need to do more of this. Planners need to do more of that. And I'm all for that. And Randy Mason earlier talked about education, and we can change, and I'm an educator, we can change the way we educate our various students in the various fields to be more generalist. Iqbal urban designer or urban planner or historic preservationist. Is there anybody, and there doesn't have to be, but anybody on this panel who would actually say, I have a concrete suggestion with regard to changing the landmarks law or some other law in the city that would change the nature of what the various institutions involved in regulating, in planning, and thinking about the future of the city of New York should be doing? Anybody who wants to put that on the table, feel free to now. Otherwise, I've got a bunch of other questions.
Gerald, I'll take Paul, go ahead.
I'll take a stab. I think there are 2 issues that, first of all, I take issue with Peg, by the way. I think there probably are still some people in the city, and some of them are with the real estate industry, and some of them are probably with the Freedom Caucus in Congress, who disagree with the concept of landmark regulation. But I think one of the issues that we face in a very significant way, and it may be a function of the landmarks law, is that one of predictability. The reason it's been much easier, its zoning becomes acceptable is because you have some idea of what the parameters of what the future regulations are going to be, particularly with the landmarks law. First, it's not always clear what the target of a designation is going to be. What is the standard, which is a very broad standard, and I'm not suggesting, I understand why it's got to have a lot of wiggle room in it, but still, it's a very broad standard, and it's very difficult as a result to predict whether or not a district is going to be designated or an individual building is going to be designated. And number 2, and I think this is more serious because it affects people over the longer term, is the regulatory experience. And in particular, the notion that somehow, once you have a historic district, and I say this mostly with historic districts because there are a lot of buildings in historic districts that, under the way the Landmarks Commission handles their reports and administers their districts, essentially become frozen, which perhaps shouldn't be frozen. And it's questionable whether that is something that is inherent in the law now, whether they have that power in the law, or whether, in fact, they should look at individual buildings in historic districts in a much more critical way. Otherwise, we run the risk of freezing these neighborhoods. And if somebody had frozen the Upper West Side in 1915, we wouldn't have all of the twin-towered apartment buildings on Central Park West. We wouldn't have what we have on Riverside Drive today. And by freezing it today, you wind up freezing a lot of tenement buildings on Amsterdam and Columbus Avenue, some of which may have some very nice decoration, but which are questionable as quality housing and which are questionable, in fact, as architecture, when you could, in fact, preserve, if you want to preserve the sense of scale and the sense of texture, there are other ways to do it. and you don't have to freeze the district.
Right, Paul, does the freezing occur at the time of designation of the historic district, or when people come in applying for a certificate of appropriateness?
Well, the way the statute is administered as a practical matter, and I say that as a practical matter because I don't think it has to be administered that way. And I think, by the way, there's a secondary effect of this, and that is that it induces some members of the public anyway to push to designate historic districts, not because the districts are historic, but because they're not happy with what the zoning allows. And so the landmarks law becomes a kind of super zoning ordinance, and maybe even a super architectural review ordinance.
So what
But
would you
it's-
do if you were living in such a district where the city planning commission wasn't paying any attention to the qualities of the neighborhood that you chose to live in? What would you do? Sit quietly while the...
I'm not saying you would sit quietly, Kent, but I'm saying that there may be ways, I'm saying even within the historic district context, okay? There are ways of administering the district in a much more flexible way where buildings that are of questionable value don't have to remain standing, where
Which was
you're
done
not
in the-
freezing
That was
things.
done, as you remember, in the Upper East Side Historic District, where a large number of buildings were identified as being of no style, and the commission had agreed in advance, those are buildings that could be demolished. So it was, I think what you're talking about is try to make it more predictable. I think a concrete suggestion might be that every few years, every 10 or 20 years, the Landmarks Commission should go back and look at the designation reports, as Claire looked at the Seaport report, and see whether it reflects the thinking of today. I remember in the Greenwich Village Historic District, Elliot Walensky, who many of you remember as the co-author of the AIA guide, took me and some of the other commissioners out to the West Village, and he showed us that when the Greenwich Village was designated, they were interested in the Federal and Greek Revival houses, and they left out all the industrial buildings which were now so revered on the far West Village. And he said something's got to be done to protect these buildings, and so those designation reports were amended. So maybe just a periodic revisitation of the designation reports would be a good thing to do.
Can I object to this notion of freezing?
Yeah,
Has anybody
Yes.
walked in Tribeca or Soho? Does anybody consider that frozen?
right.
And there are some pieces of architecture. I feared for a while that there would never be a short building left in all of New York City. And developers see a 4-story building and want to add 4 more on top of that. Well, some of that shouldn't happen. Some buildings should be left alone. And in the meantime, the commission is approving new buildings in historic districts right and left. They're approving rooftop additions and backyard additions right and left. And these places aren't frozen. That's another one of the myths that the real estate board loves to push.
I could let you, Paul, answer that, but I know Ann wanted to pile on and also disagree. So Ann, please, Paul is right here, and he'd love both of you to really.
Peg beat me to the punch. No, I think I agree completely. I was going to use Soho. What's frozen about Soho? That's simply not the case. And that is a very highly regulated historic district. I think we have extraordinary talent in this town that is able to work within a strict set of guidelines and produce some really pretty extraordinary buildings in many cases. So freezing, not a word for the table. For
All
the
right,
discussion.
let me turn though to Rick if I could. Because I know, Rick, you've expressed as an architect, you haven't used the word frozen, and if you have, by the way, you'll never use it, at least for the rest of the afternoon.
At least not while I'm sitting next to
Not
Pat.
while you're sitting, right. But you have expressed, at a time of new environmental ethos.
Yes.
New technologies for buildings, the threat that climate change and more violent weather poses, that it poses to the entire city, but it also poses to the historic city, and that maybe the sort of old rules, the old approach, I won't say the frozen approach because it's not that, but that somehow we need to develop a new thinking about what it even means to be a landmark or a building, an improvement in a historic district. Why don't you take it off from there?
Sure. Well, first, I believe
And Jed, you're next.
It is a belief system. I believe in the preservation of landmark districts. It says something about who we are as a people, what we do with the fragile resources that have been left to us by previous generations. And for me, it's a very complex topic, but I'm a visual learner. Stand on the corner of 23rd and 6th, picture it, and look north, and then look south. And which world do you want to live in? Which city do you want to be a part of? So for me, that's the simplest example I can possibly think of. The historic district is a wonderful and beautiful place, and the things that are simply towers on 6-story bases aren't as rich, aren't as interesting, don't have as much economic benefit. So as a belief system, I think these are really, really good. At one time, city planning, we're talking about city planning, they came to us. There's a saying that goes back, attributed to Con Howe. Why, when we get what we asked for, it's not what we wanted? And the zoning, Amanda Burden and Alex Washburn came out to some of the green architects and they said, what is so wrong with the zoning text? Why we're getting these buildings that look like this? What is wrong? And we said it's really simple. You're giving zoning floor area to the outside of the wall, so there's incentive to make the wall as flat as possible. Give us a zoning deduction for a high-performance, deep textured wall. What else? And they go, well, buildings always had projections, light and shadow. We use solar shading. And they go, you need solar shading? Yes, please. About how much? 30 inches, we decided. Give us solar shading on the outside. And the zoning text changed to address this. We had written text that was a little too narrow, and I believe under what's called zone green, it allows more flexibility for better buildings that are higher performing and both visually higher performing also because of light and shadow and texture that we want. So my point in a landmark district is that I think that the two stewardship ethics, environmental stewardship and historic resource stewardship, are sister ethics, and they must be married somehow. We've been at war a little bit too much over this topic, and clearly there's a fork in the road. Existing buildings, higher degree of care, first do no harm, and then new buildings. And what I'm proposing in the certificate of appropriateness for both of those, I think that we need to take a much firmer stance and much clearer look on what are the environmental impacts of these buildings. Storm water management. We're in the penthouse of the Simpson, Crawford, and Simpson department store. It was originally built as a dining room, and we have this incredibly beautiful green roof. It absorbs storm water. We have bees making honey. We have employees harvesting. It changes the way that we work in the city, and it does something else. Is that historically accurate to have a garden on the roof of that building? Probably not, but I do think it makes a healthy, vibrant city. It makes the adaptive reuse of these buildings meaningful to a wider range of people, and we need more advocates. We need more people to fight back on those who are trying to destroy the fragile resources. And I would say in new buildings, we need a new language about appropriateness, including, it's a little late, so we'll be designing for storm resiliency and mitigation. We had the blessing of being involved in the historic Front Street project. We poured our hearts into that project, 11 existing buildings, 3 new buildings woven together. And in Sandy, there was a 6-foot high salt line, and the buildings were closed for a year. So designing for storm resiliency is also something I think we have to do. We have to take it into consideration when we're talking about stewardship of these resources.
So would you then be expanding the word appropriateness? I have here,
Yes.
For an improvement in a historic district, the law requires consideration of, quote, factors of aesthetic, historical, and architectural values and significance, architectural style, design, arrangement, texture, material, and color. And are you saying add stormwater resilience and green walls as well?
I am saying absolutely that we need to think about future generations' use of these buildings, and the way to do it is to make them adaptable for a rapidly changing world. So I'm saying absolutely we should change the text and make this a quantifiable consideration in the certificate of appropriateness process.
And the LPC should be doing that. And as a result, they better have on staff and, on the commission itself, the volunteer commission, people who have expertise on that as well. Of course, since there's some architects on it, we have that by definition. But seriously, I mean, I'm just asking, you want to expand that, or should there be an overlay somewhere else? But you're basically, you've said, no, I want I do want to expand that.
I think it's important to craft an argument for appropriateness. We talk about history, both cultural, we talk about paint chip analysis, we talk about many, many things, and we weave this crazy tapestry of an argument for what's appropriate. I'm saying this should absolutely be a building block for an appropriateness argument.
By the way, one other thing, some people have claimed that this is the Pandora's box. You open this up, and now we should throw in affordable housing as well, and all sorts of other things. I see this when there are discussions of incentive zoning in New York. You know, I want it for a plaza. No, I want it for affordable housing. No, I want it for a theater. And of course, Penson wants it for himself at Grand Central Terminal. Everybody's battling for my development, my right, you know. So I wonder with this kind of expansion. Let me finally, Jed, you're leaning back there. Don't fall down. You know, that happened to me once. But you seem very, very relaxed and happy. I assume you're making money at Domino. And why don't you speak to us and tell us what you're thinking?
All we do at Domino is spend money these days. No income there yet. No, I'm clearly here to provide the other side of the equation a little bit. And I certainly think we're a city that deserves and is entitled to some sort of landmark protection. And I'm also somebody that thinks that legislating nostalgia can be very dangerous. I think most people come to big urban cities because they have a sense of dynamism and because they want them to change. And I think a large part of this debate lacks context, right? The world's been around for thousands and thousands of years. I think it's very hard for us to predict what this city would or should look like 100 years from now or 50 years from now. We all very much apply our own thoughts and experiences. We've been here for several decades, most of us. But as one of my colleagues pointed out, if you had landmarked chunks of the city at different points in time, we'd have a very different and less prosperous city. So I think landmarking large swaths of the city, which we've done over the last 50 years, I don't know what the percentage of Manhattan that is in a district today, but I think it's a pretty big number. To argue that that has no negative impact on economic functions of our city in terms of the supply side of the equation is not accurate. Okay, it's also not the sole, government intervention that regulates supply. There are lots of others, but it's certainly an obvious condition in our highly regulated cities, New York and San Francisco being the two obvious examples in this country that are in some sort of demand, that real estate prices are crazy. So people like me are the long-term beneficiaries of that because government creates a regulated industry which distorts natural economics. And again, landmarks is not at all the only component of this. In fact, it's a pretty small component, I would argue. But the accumulation of all of the government regulation definitely impacts the natural allocation of capital and what people would naturally do, and creates shortages, in this case mainly of housing. And it does change what people are capable of doing. I can say, and I'm not an expert in the whole city at all, had Dumbo been landmarked 25 years ago, we would have not created the neighborhood that we did there. Okay, that's just a fact. So to sit here and say, well, places like Soho haven't seen any negative, haven't been negatively affected by landmarking, I don't think that we know that. You can say certain things about Soho are perfectly healthy in spite of landmarking. You can say certain things have gotten done in spite of landmarking. But you can't say that it's had no negative or downward pressure on things, or it hasn't quelled some sort of an imaginative response. I think those things are very hard to clearly articulate. You never know what the other side of the coin would have been. And I also think, so in terms of a specific proposal, if you want a specific proposal of mine, I would put a time limit on landmarking. Okay, I think landmarking is done at one moment in time. I think it's very hard to foresee the future. And I think maybe the designations should expire every 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 or some number of years. And people should reassess the balance of the benefits and costs of that action. And all of the landmarkings have benefits on certain sides of the coin. Okay, you're certainly protecting certain aspects of a neighborhood that certain people like and aspire to, and they also unequivocally have costs in terms of what could be created in their absence. And I think to have things have permanence is a terribly dangerous thing. And the long-term cumulative impact of this is very hard to study, but it clearly affects the supply side of the equation. And as I said, it clearly benefits people like us that own property in this town long-term.
Is anybody arguing that New York City hasn't grown? You go down the west side of Manhattan.
I'll argue that it hasn't grown nearly as much as it should.
You know,
I'll certainly argue that.
you can go down the west side of Manhattan, and I think they've emptied out about 5 western states and moved the population down along the river. There is growth everywhere. There is plenty of room in this town for both preservation and growth. And I think the question is, do you want to live in Shanghai? Do you want to live in a city of tall glass towers? Or do you want a variety, and do you want neighborhoods where people have made their homes and feel comfortable? And I am on the side that says there should be both, but you can't look at an historic district only in the negative. Of course, if you tear all the buildings down on the west side and east side and build, 80-story towers, you're going to have more luxury condos. But what kind of city are we looking for? And we're looking for a balance, because there's room for all of us.
Well, we're getting ready to talk about that. I wonder if somebody on the panel or in the Mark or somebody could tell us what percentage of the city's properties are subject to regulation by the Landmarks Commission? At 3%. So
How much in Manhattan, south of 96th
and how much in
Street?
Manhattan? 47%? 27% of Manhattan is subject. Parcels or square foot, says Mr. Lustbader. What's the parcels? Okay, so is this, does that change your criticism, or just illuminate it?
No, I don't find that 27% of Manhattan should be landmarked. I don't think that 20% of our island is built to that standard. I think that's way too high a number myself.
So Jed, how would you feel about 15%? No, I mean, I think this is an interesting question. I was being not sarcastic exactly, but I mean, because there is this problem of coming up with the right number, and I want to go back to Raju in the end, because Raju worked for the city planning department for a while, and then he was with the Municipal Art Society, and now he's with the city council. By the way, only because he is a superb planner, not because he, was anything other. And so, if with your experience deeply in sort of planning that looks at preservation as simply one piece of the puzzle for a city, in which we would all agree there are other pieces, and Peg is saying, hey, let the other pieces be elsewhere, and we even heard, by the way, within the Landmarks Law, it serves many different masters in terms of goals, but let's just say basically landmarks is supposed to worry about landmarks. But somebody has to figure out whether Jed is right at 27% or 15% or 20%. I mean, that may be a crude number, but there is some judgment to be made about whether or not the landmarks, and especially the historic districts, are doing something that in some ways is very, very positive, in other ways may be less positive, and make a judgment about that based on what could be called costs and benefits. And it seems to me, at least right now, LPC is not supposed to be doing that under the law. But somebody in the city of New York, it could be the mayor, it could be the city council, or the city planning commission should be doing that. Do you, Raju, think that makes sense? And if so, how should they be doing it? Is it enough under the law that they get the historic districts, CPC, they have a hearing, they are required to make they're required to give a recommendation, if any. I love that, by the way. They have to give it, but if they have one, they have to give it. But they have to give it and say maybe but it goes to the city council on historic districts. And then let the city council do it. This is ultimately a values-based political kind of decision with the recommendation of the planners for the city who know everything, take everything into account. Is the system broken?
So a couple of, I think, ways of approaching that question. And we were having this conversation, I think, before the panel as well, which is that I think this intersection between preservation and policy is a very complicated one. And that, I think the point I was trying to raise earlier was that preservation is, and I think Rick got to this point when he described 23rd Street and 6th Avenue, is a very specific way of looking at the world. It's tactile, can be specific, can be very emotional, I think, as Rick was sort of evoking. And the policy discussions we have as a city around how we grow, how much we grow, are at a very different, or very different tools we have to analyze those kinds of questions. And so this intersection of how important is this building or this neighborhood as is today, and how important that we grow, I think we grapple with them with very different techniques. And I think this is what I was suggesting earlier, is that I think preservationists need to become more confident grappling with the policy questions in policy, with policy tools. Because I think the perspectives sometimes don't fully translate. And I think that's one of the big challenges we have as a city as we discuss these conversations. I think we talk past each other. And how do we create a shared language, a shared set of skills so we can grapple with those questions
So Raju, should Mayor DeBlasio and Alicia Glenn call up Meenakshi and say, look, you and your commissioners, I want you to cut down on these historic districts. Enough already. We have too many of them. I have other goals, and I want you to just stop it. And Meenakshi says, well, I don't know what Meenakshi is going to say in that conversation.
I think they might have had that conversation.
Well, I don't know whether they did. I wasn't there, and I'm looking at Meenakshi over there. That may be an unfair kind of comment. I don't know. I'm an outsider here. It strikes me that if you really know that, fine, but if you don't know that, maybe it's not fully fair. So, but it's a legitimate question for the mayor to be talking about this without a call, you would agree, to Meenakshi. There's nothing wrong with Mayor DeBlasio saying, I think we've gone too far with preservation. You may disagree with him, but certainly that's what he's supposed to do, and he'll be in office, he won't be in office. And by the way, in Washington, D.C., it's much more express. I see Peter there smiling away as the mayor's agent on the commission in D.C. who can decide that a building and a use has such special merit for purposes other than historic preservation, that it overrides historic preservation. Now, your example, Peter, this morning was actually quite wonderful, and it struck me with your firehouse, all right? So we all agree fire is important. And, you know, Peter, for those of you who didn't see it, showed two slides. One had the firehouse as it had always been with small doors. And with our modern fire trucks, they're just not going to get through those doors. And then he showed, you know, basically the override from the mayor's agent of larger doors. And I was thinking to myself, I could resolve that question in two different ways. One is to say it's more important that the use of the fire department stay in those buildings for historic preservation purposes, so we got to have larger doors. I mean, we're not going to let people die, you know. Or alternatively, actually, it's the building that's more important. So what? Keep the small doors and, you know, but, you know, that's a decision. Or it could be on affordable housing. I just don't think that's beyond the pale. The question simply is, should LPC be doing this or somebody else be doing it? And then there's that call to Meenakshi, as I said.
But that's a Hobson's choice that you
Yeah.
presented us with. And happily, because we have a terrific design community, we don't have to decide whether it's a choice between putting out the fire and saving the building. We can design doors that work in that building that let the fire trucks out. And that's basically what happens. I mean, basically, there is not a long list of people or instances that people are complaining about. It's even to go back to Jed's 22% or whatever it is being too much. I think it'd be very interesting to ask a group that has traditionally opposed historic preservation, building by building, district by district, with testimony, to now the real estate board to reflect on which buildings that have been designated or which districts that have been designated over the last 50 years do they wish would now be changed, would be shrunk or would be altogether eliminated. It'd be interesting to hear anybody's view of that. My own hunch is that it's not going to be a long list. That people basically like and appreciate and approve of and cherish the things that have been designated.
So Rick, Paul, and Ann are the next speakers.
Well, I think there's one interesting example that, based on the 1964 Civil rights legislation, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that meant that we were going to try to design for the widest possible audience to these beautiful buildings that we are the stewards of. I have watched the Landmarks Preservation Commission take this extremely seriously. And the first is not questioning the fact that you need to provide accessibility. It's the fire doors. That use must happen. People need to get in. We need to design for all citizens. And what the preservation community has done, and by having landmarking, we're doing it at an extraordinarily high quality level as opposed to plopping a landmark left or very insensitive ramp. It's being done every single month if you watch what happens down at the Preservation Commission. And it's being done at a very high quality level by people who love and care for these resources. So there's no question that we need, nobody's saying that the Landmarks Preservation Commission is not saying, I'm sorry, you can't come into these buildings. They're taking it very seriously that that use is important and it's a mandate. And now the only question is how we adapt these landmarks to the quality level that they deserve.
Okay, so while I have, forgetting for the moment that there are reservations, I've expressed reservations about the way historic districts are administered. In particular, I think the issue of the Landmarks Commission's role in the designation process relative to the other agencies is a question that I think the way the system is set up today actually is a pretty rational one. And it's really a question of whether each piece of it does its work properly. Because if Landmarks does its work properly, it will identify those buildings that are worthy of preservation, that fairly meet the statutory standard. And yes, that may change over time, but there are standards that ought to be met. If city planning does its role, which I don't think it's doing today, by the way, it will be much more active, particularly in historic districts, in addressing the relationship between that district and the planning, and addressing the relationship between designation and what other public actions might be appropriate in order to accomplish the public policy goals of the administration. And putting that in front of the city council in the end, while I think all of us at one time or another have disagreed with a council decision about designation, they are the voice of the people, as it were, and I think for better or for worse, that's where these decisions ought to be made, subject to the mayor's ability to override. And the council's ability to override the mayor, yes.
Well, I'm going to take this to a slightly different level. I'm assuming I'm sitting here because I worked for New York State for 28 years and at the New York State Council on the Arts, and always recognized that New York City, we tend in New York City to think we live in a vacuum and that this law exists in a vacuum. It doesn't. It doesn't. There's an ecosystem for preservation, both on the legal side and the programmatic side, that operates at every level of government. It starts in the neighborhoods, it goes up through the cities, the towns, the cities, the villages, up to the state, up to the feds, and all, at every level, there are incentives, there are opportunities, and there are really positive things about preservation. And we need to remember that we exist in that broader context. So one of the things we have not been particularly good at in New York City, and here's perhaps a task for Menashe, is we've never been good about selling the benefits of preservation. Yes, we do it on individual bases, and certainly every developer in town knows that it can be a positive and that you can actually create a really spectacular domino project using preservation as one of the tools in the toolbox. But we're talking about a city of well over 8 million people. The populations are changing. People are coming from all over the planet here to the city, and some of those people are moving into historic districts. We're not doing a good enough job of educating those people about the positive benefits of preservation. And I would suggest that that task not just be left to the civic groups, to the Landmarks Conservancy or the Historic Districts Council or any of the other wonderful nonprofits across town who struggle hard with this, but that in fact it be a role of the commission as well, that role of public education, of recognizing that many of the people who live in your historic districts don't understand what those two words mean, historic preservation. We have to do a better job of educating people why this is a positive and not just talk about how big your garage door can be. I think that serves certainly serves the purpose of getting more people out there, educating people in districts, but it also gives a very positive spin to the Landmarks Commission. So there you go. And for that, we're all going to have to argue hard for a larger staff. It is woefully understaffed. It's not just the all-volunteer commissioners, but the professional staff at the Landmarks Commission is a shocking nightmare. I'll put it right out there. Not in terms of being too small.
Yeah. Could I also add that New York State is the largest user, developers in New York State are the largest users of federal tax credits for preservation.
Right.
And we also have state tax credits for preservation, which are quite limited, but do apply to lower income areas, which can be very helpful. And that creates billions
Right.
of development projects in this state every year. And the state puts out a report that nobody reads, and the Park Service puts out a report that nobody reads. But they should be, we should be
Absolutely.
doing our best to disseminate them because it's good economic development that these tax credits are promoting, and it's preservation.
Right, so would civil society be happy to see the Landmarks Preservation Commission become a cheerleader, a be-all agency for landmarks preservation? Which, by the way, is not inconsistent with its mandate as it currently exists.
Right, what's wrong
And
with
yes,
that?
they're thinking about staff and all that, but it's not. It's not necessarily just a ministerial regulatory agency in terms of the law itself.
No, and the commission is doing an excellent job these days of letting the public know what it's doing, what's coming up at Landmarks, how Landmarks has decided. But there are commissions around the country that put out newsy things too. We just did this district, and here's a little history, and here's why these buildings are important. Or we just did this old stone house, in the Bronx, and here's why this is important. And by the way, there were 3 more tax credits that came through, and they make it human. And, the various preservation groups are trying to do it in their own way, but the commission could be doing it as well, again, with proper staffing, which I agree. And going back to Rick's point, I don't think we've solved the issues, but I think preservationists have grappled for the last several years on, are we green? We always say the oldest buildings are the greenest, but how we deal with climate change and how we deal with preservation and how in many cases the older buildings were so well built that they do preserve a lot of energy. So we're not there entirely, but we haven't been closed to this. We've all been looking at it.
So let's sort of finish with a little bit of the weeds issue here and the relationship between designation and certificates of appropriateness. We've heard earlier today about other systems, and particular systems where there's more nuance to the types of buildings that are landmarked. In the UK system, there's grade 1 and grade 2 with an asterisk and grade 2 without an asterisk, et cetera. And one can imagine having a system of that sort which would result in lesser or greater obligations depending on what grade you were. So obviously if you were grade 1, and grade 1 in Britain listed buildings are of exceptional interest, grade 2 asterisk, particularly important buildings of more than special interest, and grade 2 listed are of just special interest. Does this sort of system improve potentially the operation of historic preservation in the city of New York?
And it would certainly improve the income opportunities for the land use bar. I think
But that's why Paul was trying to get in before you
ruined it
spoke.
for me, Ken.
It's a full employment act for lawyers.
I mean, it seems to me that
Actually, for
all that
architects
does is
as well.
invite enormous numbers of arguments. Oh, it's only a grade 2 building, we can certainly bulldoze it.
So I take it you're for this idea.
I'm for being, as I think I tried to say earlier, as explicit as possible and updating your explicitness from time to time. But I don't think having varying gradings of landmark protection makes any sense. I mean, basically, the idea when you read the law this morning, which was great, it's a wonderful law, and I'm looking at what we can see, which you can't, of the leaders of the bar, many of whom participated in not only drafting the law, but defending the law, like Cy Vance. And it was a well-written law, very simple to administer, but the The background at the time the law was passed was it was believed that all buildings in New York were going to be threatened sooner or later. That we're losing so many historic structures. The idea was to create a list of buildings the city should put itself to work to help save. That sometimes before the law, a building would be torn down and somebody said, well, it's too bad we didn't know that. We could have moved an agency in there or found a buyer. So the whole idea was that the Landmarks Commission wasn't just going to be designating and wasn't just going to be regulating, but it was going to be creating plans for the survival of these buildings. Happily, in some sense, that world has changed, but as we were reminded in the last panel, we have a rapidly changing city, and historic district designation, historic protection may come with some burdens, and which people are not ready to assume. Peg's group has a program called Sacred Sites, which helps religious institutions. Many religious institutions are unlike the Archdiocese of New York, let's say, are single churches with not enough money. They're struggling to fix the roof. They're not very sophisticated. What the Sacred Sites program has done is to bring technical assistance and hand-holding to those institutions.
And money.
And so the Landmarks Commission's third role, which we haven't spoken about here, could very well be to help make historic districts more affordable, help make the renovation of buildings easier to contemplate, and that'd be a great role for it.
Please,
know-
Paul. No, Paul
Oh,
was,
sorry.
he really was ready to speak.
Sorry. No.
No, I think we actually have a system today, Kent, and there are two standards. There are style buildings and there are no style buildings. So the question is every style building worthy of preservation? And I posit that that's not the case. I posit that a Raphael Candela apartment house on Park Avenue, or maybe not on Park Avenue, but a Raphael Candela apartment house may be more worthwhile to save that than a new law tenement on Columbus Avenue, particularly where you have many new law tenements that are very similar on Columbus Avenue.
And I don't think anybody would disagree, but you've got a mechanism.
But we don't have a mechanism today. That's the problem. The problem is we have two standards, and a more sophisticated system of gradation, I think, would be helpful in terms of the evolution of historic districts, because it would preserve what should be preserved. I think it would also make historic districts more acceptable from the real estate industry's perspective. Because with all due respect, Peg, where you have a 4 FAR zone, the real estate industry isn't going to want to build 10 FAR buildings. They're going to build 4 FAR buildings, or whatever the height limit is, the 60-foot height limit. They're going to respect that zoning. If they are permitted to redevelop buildings that perhaps ought to be in a position where they can be redeveloped. And I think that's the problem, and one way to do that is to establish some more than two standards for buildings within districts. Okay.
Jed posed the idea of having a sort of, after 25 years, almost like a sunset rule, I guess, for landmarks. And I heard of a few sighs in the audience. I didn't read that as affirmation of the idea. It is interesting to think about what forces us to rethink things. Let me ask maybe a different question, which really relates to this 30-year rule that we do have. Is anybody prepared to say, you know what, I think it was Raul who was suggesting that there could be a landmark that hadn't even been built yet, or somebody was suggesting, I think it was Raul. Should we take out that 30-year rule? I'm not saying we're going to do it, but should we get rid of that and just say a landmark is whatever the LPC finally says it is, given the criteria that it applies? It's not untethered discretion. And why limit it to 30? Or alternatively, do we lose public credibility when we actually suggest that a building that opened its doors yesterday could be a landmark, and the public, which after all at the end of the day has to support these laws, says, this isn't a landmark law anymore, this is ridiculous. So I asked that question. Anne?
This may well be unpopular, but I'll say it anyway, what the heck. I had a lot of trouble when we all allowed the Museum of American Folk Art to be torn down. That was a 12-year-old building, designed by a great American architecture firm, and I would posit that that was a landmark, that would have been a landmark 30 years out from the day it was built. We can disagree, that's fine, but I will put right out there that it was a building that reflected its time. It was quite extraordinary. It was a beautiful building, beautifully crafted, and we let it come down. I'm wondering why we wouldn't, in certain circumstances, allow the designation of a building that's that's older than 30 years, and maybe we could do something like that special merit exemption that we were talking about earlier. If you can make your doors wider in a fire, why couldn't we think about that in the same way? In extraordinary circumstances, a building that's not yet 30 years old could still be protected.
You know, the National Register districts, Ground Zero was made eligible for listing on the National Register when it's usually a 50-year period because something extraordinary happened there that the country wanted to recognize. And let's hope we don't have anything like that to worry about again. But your notion of if there's something that's recognized now, maybe there should be a way to designate. But I don't think it should be just, this popped up yesterday, so it's a landmark. I think a little perspective adds something.
I think it was tied originally to the complaint of building owners that they wanted to retire the mortgage before the dead hand of the past that came in.
So I've just been informed that we have to actually leave the room apparently a little earlier than I thought.
Is this something someone said?
I was just informed that we had to leave the room a little earlier. So what I'd like to do is take the rest of our time now, in any event, to turn to you in the audience. I know I've seen Meenakshi, you have your hand up first, and I think because you are the chair, you get to speak first, and then we can go to other hands up in the audience. So be thinking, and we'll pass around a mic. And Meenakshi, why don't you take a microphone, because I think that will be helpful. So,
all right.
Please.
It's on. I don't actually have a question. I'm kind of regretting I even went ahead and agreed to this, but anyway, I just wanted to say a few things in response to some of the things that were said today. So first of all, to Paul, while I can understand your comment about predictability.
Could you be a little louder, Meenakshi? I think the microphone,
okay.
I don't know if we can get.
Turn it more toward
Like that?
Yes.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
it is. Thank you.
so just to respond to Paul, that I can understand your comment about predictability in historic districts, but I would agree with some of the colleagues at the table who noted that, in fact, we do not freeze development within our historic districts, and in fact, the Commission often discusses and puts the message out there that we allow for change, but we look to find ways to make sure that the change is appropriate. Just in response to Peg, no, the mayor and the deputy mayor have not called me to their room and told me, don't do any more historic districts. So I just want to get that across as well.
Good to know. Good to know.
In response to something that Rick said, and I completely agree, I think the Commission very often strives to include issues that have come up more recently, issues of resiliency, issues of handicap accessibility and sustainability into our historic districts, and we take and into our historic buildings, and we take great pride in that. And we do encourage architects and developers to look at incorporating these kind of issues into their buildings in a sensitive way. And finally, on two other issues, we try to be ambassadors to our cause as well. And in fact, we spend a lot of time working with communities, especially when we're looking at historic districts, to explain to them the benefits of preservation and having their buildings designated. And finally, about the human touch and humanizing what we do put out a newsletter where we try and identify the things that that the Commission does and showcase our work, as well as on our website. And I encourage everyone to take a look at that. So if you want to see a human face, just come to our agency. There are a lot of beautiful people out there. And I'm going to give the mic.
Great. Could we please pass the microphone to this gentleman over here? And you're waiting for the microphone because it goes on the video. And please identify yourself and then ask your question.
I'm Leo Blackman. I'm the former chair of the board of the Historic Districts Council, and you were asking for concrete suggestions. I have a few. First of all, for the city planning department, the planning that they do seems to be primarily for sites that developers are already developing, which I think is not very healthy. It would be nice if city planning actually planned, which they haven't done in the 40 years that I've lived in New York. And I think another easy thing that they could do is eliminate the plaza bonus, because I think the last decent building that came out of a plaza bonus was probably about, 1959. And it's been really badly used in the Flower District lately with horrible, horrible hotels where that space is all used for a restaurant. There are two things that I think landmarks could do differently. One is I think it's about time, in fact it's well past time for landmarks to survey the whole city. They don't have the resources to do that. It was really interesting to hear that in LA they've gotten funds from a foundation to do that. But I think there are lots of ways to do that, and it only requires a little bit of political will, which again, don't start me on. And the other thing is that I think it's really unfair that Rick talked about 23rd Street North and South, and I think it's really unfair that people who live outside of historic districts don't have any kind of regulation over the kind of stuff that goes up in their neighborhood, a lot of which is kind of crappy. I'm again thinking of the Flower District just for starts, but I think that landmarks should actually regulate, except they'd have to have a lot more staff, but I think they should regulate every new building that goes up because developers don't seem like they can be trusted to do something that isn't kind of cheap and tawdry. So.
Thanks. Over there in back, please. Please. Identify yourself and your question or brief comment.
Hi, my name is Ken Luspater, and I work with the J.M. Kaplan Fund. And I just want to comment on what has been a red herring about the 25% number in Manhattan. 27% today. It used to be 25, but I guess the commission's been busy since Menache's tenure. We are commissioning the Furman Center to do a study along with the New York Community Trust, and preliminary information is that 9% of the lot area are in historic districts in Manhattan, and 17% are individual landmarks. So, and of those 17%, who knows how many are municipal buildings already, as well as Grand Central or Central Park. So it's really, I think that we have to quantify what is really regulated, and within Manhattan, its historic districts are a much smaller percentage than is being portrayed here. So,
Mark Twain had an aphorism for that, statistics down, okay. So it is true that there are a lot of numbers being thrown around. By the way, I thought Brian McCabe did a superb job of being very measured in his presentation, and the studies that they've done actually are very, very solid and very, very careful, and perhaps that's why they don't show dramatic results, because they're actually looking at the case. But thank you for that comment. Other people, right here, please, and microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Victor Principe. I sit on the commission, in the Historic Preservation Commission in a small village on Long Island called Bellport, and I also live in New York City. And my question, actually, I want to direct it to Peg Green. She mentioned Shanghai, and it reminded me of an editorial she wrote in the Commission's newsletter, regarding the tall buildings that are being built on 57th Street. And I just wanted to know what your opinion is of these buildings. Why hasn't there been any outcry, as there has been in the past, about the shadows on Central Park? And especially the fact that they're building now a building right on Central Park South, where 220 Central Park South was, which is going to be very tall and right at the edge of the park. This will really tower over the park, much more so than the buildings that are being built on 57th Street. So what is your reaction to this, and what can the landmarks and also the commission that you're on do about it?
I'm with the Conservancy. I don't write for the commission
Conservancy,
newsletter. I doubt they'd let me. There has been an outcry over the buildings on 57th Street. There's been a massive outcry. The local community board, I think almost 2 years ago now, had an evening session, and they had to move it to a larger space because over 500 people showed up. And the basic answer to the buildings on 57th Street is that mostly they're as of right, which is a whole other concept in zoning. And my response to that was, again, 57th Street, Central Park South, it's a limited area. And why can't landmarks and why can't city planning walk up and down the street and say this should be designated? You know, this is a development site. You know, you've got a limited area. So I think the 57th Street buildings have ignited a real debate and unease in a lot of people in the city, that all of a sudden these have sprouted out. But that's a whole other issue of, you know, as of right zoning. But people have been concerned about shadows. The developers will tell you the skinnier buildings aren't going to cast the shadows as long. It's a debate. But I think it's clear that the administration, I think Carl Weisbrod has been saying, that that's an area that can handle tall buildings, and that's where the administration, you know, is fine with them. So it's a question of, you know, do you want to look at long-term zoning and tackle as of right, which, you know, could keep Paul in business forever? And if enough people are upset about this, then there has to be a coalition that hasn't quite formed yet. But I think everyone is talking about those buildings, not just on 57th, but on the edges of historic districts elsewhere.
Is it all right to add something? It was depressing that among the people that were surprised with the buildings going up on 57th Street were the City Planning Commission. That rezoning was done when a decision was made to downzone the east side up to along Madison Avenue. To satisfy the development community, there had to be a quick upzoning on the west side. And Times Square was upzoned, and the line went all the way up to Columbus Circle and then looped around to pick up 57th Street. And when asked later, well, why did you do that? The answer was, well, we never thought anybody would build it. And so I think it's an illustration of why the city ought to pay a little bit more attention to what it wants to have. I don't think it's a job for the Landmarks Commission on 57th Street. It was a job for a more alert City Planning Commission than we had at that time, and it's a good reason to revisit from time to time what you zone is, and that just didn't happen.
So,
Can I add one quick thing? I think those buildings are also a reflection of the fact, as I was saying earlier, that this is a global city. We live in a very broad context, and maybe we should, frankly, I think the buildings are dreadful, but maybe we should take it all as a compliment, because after all, there's money, billions of dollars coming in from overseas, and they're putting it here because we're a democracy, and real estate in New York is a great thing to have in your portfolio. And somebody's wealth manager in Russia is telling people to send your money over there, and you don't ever have to live in those apartments, just buy one. And so there's this tsunami of money.
It's a
coming into the
compliment,
city.
but how do you explain that to the kid in the playground this afternoon who's has to go home an hour and a half early because the playground is
So the way we explain it is we say, you're having a discussion about zoning. Next year, we're going to be celebrating or marking the 100th anniversary of New York City's 1916 zoning resolution. And in fact, because Carl Weisbrod saw, well, this isn't actually true, they're both doing it independently, there's going to be a conference celebrating next year with the City Planning Commission, the 100th, and Ann and Kent will take your video of this and open the... I think it's interesting that we end with a discussion about the City Planning Commission because it reveals in some way that landmarks is an issue that spans obviously everything in the city and that there is more involved than just the LPC. But we have, I think, focused on the LPC. So there's a little choreography to do. Please allow me another several minutes. First, I'd like to thank the panel. Just wait a second. Then I'm going to ask Meenakshi to come up. So I'd like to thank Raju, Jed, Ann, Kent, Paul, Peg, and Rick. I think they've done a marvelous job. It's hard with everybody on a panel like this. I wish Jed could have spoken a little more, and it wasn't his fault, but he's been here. So let's please thank these panelists for their marvelous. I did mention Ann. Well, I mentioned Ann. Paul said I didn't mention Ann, but I did mention Ann. Yes, I did.
Especially.
Yeah, okay. Now, what I'd like to do is call up Meenakshi, if I could, up to here. And so what I'd like to say, and then I'm going to turn it over to Meenakshi. But what I'd like to say is I cannot imagine having a better partner in creating a conference of this sort. And I've said this before, it's actually quite unusual for an agency, an official agency, that actually has more at stake than a Harvard professor, you know,
So it seems.
in many different ways, maybe a worse life, but more at stake, to hold this sort of thing. There's an element of I think, courage, but confidence as well. And I just want to say it's been an absolute delight to work with you. I'm going to mention several other people as well, but to work with you on this conference. So thank you very, very much. It's been terrific to collaborate with the Landmarks Preservation Commission and you. So first of all. Now, I do also have to say one other thing. Mark, you have been absolutely stunning and fantastic as a partner here. And we could not have done this without you. This is Mark Silberman, so please congratulate him. There have been a variety of other important participants here that I've got to know more or less. Sarah Carroll, Damaris Oliva, Lisa Kursevich, Lauren George, and I know there are other people that you can thank on the staff itself and the commissioners. But really, the LPC has been fantastic, and thanks very, very much. So let me now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gerald. I think this conference has just been fabulous and truly invigorating. So ignore that little comment I made over there. I was just being, facetious. I think it's just been terrific. First of all, I'd like to thank all the panelists that we've had today who've taken out their time and traveled away from cities to participate in our conference. I have to say I'm blown away by the level of expertise, analysis, thought, ideas, arguments, and interests that they have brought and shared with all of us. And I personally feel extremely excited and informed by today's discussion. So thank you all, and I think we should just give them a round of applause or something. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, Christina Davis. I hope she's still here. She's been just terrific. And the Landmarks Preservation Foundation. They have continually supported our mission, and they've just been terrific. The Bar Association and the AIA. And of course, most importantly, Gerald Caden, whose enthusiasm, passion, and sense of humor has been so infectious that it was really hard to say no when he approached me about creating this platform today. It's his brainchild, but very quickly adopted by LPC, my staff, myself, and it's been truly very satisfying. And I'd also like to thank the LPC staff. Several of them are here today who have volunteered, and I see their beautiful faces, but I can't identify all of them. But again, a special thanks to the team who've worked with me, I think, every week for the last, 3 months. So Sarah Carroll, our executive director, she's here, I know, somewhere. Mark Silberman, just the intellectual powerhouse, I must say, and just truly amazing. Our general counsel, Lisa Kursevich, our Director of Strategic Planning and Special Projects, Damaris Olivo, our Director of Communications, and Lauren George, our Director of Intergovernmental and Community Relations. Just love you all. Thank you so much for helping me in this endeavor. And lastly, I want to thank all of you who've participated and showed up today, and hopefully have been enlightened by today's ideas and arguments. And finally, to the next 50 years of historic preservation. Thank you all.